Hello, I'm Marcus Louth, and welcome to the Anomaly Project, The Breakdown, the show where we look back at some of the interesting things we touched on but didn't get a chance to discuss in more detail in our recent episode. Now, recently myself and STEVE MERA spoke with paranormal researcher and CEO of Rocky Mountain Ranch Research, Katie Paige, and it was a truly fascinating conversation, and you'll be doing yourself a deep injustice if you don't check out the episode in full. Now, we touched on many thought-provoking subjects, including strange locations. Now, one of these locations that we mentioned was the Four Corners, a meeting point of four of the strangest and paranormally active states in America: Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. Here is Katie speaking a little bit about this. Like you say, so these places are all over the place, but I mean, if you could talk to me a little bit about San Luis Valley, and the importance of Colorado in general, because we mentioned about the military presence there, and as I understand it, there's a particularly heavy, if discreet, military presence in Colorado as well. So it's like they're looking at this stuff too. So if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's so many ideas around that. I mean, you're talking Colorado Springs is home of the, United States Air Force Academy, home of NORAD,
Yeah.
Fort Carson. We have a huge military training facility in the south corner of, by Trinidad, where we have the Miller Ranch and more mutilations and more high strangeness. And Dulce is right there over the border in New Mexico. And you mentioned the Four Corners area. And 3 years ago, the one of the King family descendants, Carrie King, who is the great nephew of Nellie King, who was the owner of Snippy the horse out there in the San Luis Valley. And Snippy the horse was really before viral was viral like it is today on the internet. This is the really first recognized globally viral animal mutilations. So for the past 6 months, Tony Angiola and I, only because thanks to the National UFO Historical Record Center, which just recently acquired the long-lost APRO files, and APRO is the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, and for over 35 years, these files were not accessible to people. And they were the ones that did the heavy lifting and investigation on this Snippy the horse case. And of course, the King family had a few events out in the San Luis Valley, so get to know the family, and we're talking about the mystery of Snippy.
Now, this region is of such interest that in recent years, NASA have conducted extensive studies there. Now, these studies officially are to investigate unexplained emissions of methane detected there. However, there are some people who have raised an eyebrow or two at the real reason for NASA's interest in the Four Corners region of the United States. Now, if we look briefly at the four states concerned, Arizona, for example, has more than its fair share of UFO sightings, perhaps not least the infamous Phoenix Lights sighting of March 1997. The area is also home to many supposed portals and vortex areas, with, like all of the Four Corner states concerned, many electromagnetic anomalies. Now, much the same can be said for New Mexico, that is not only home to the Roswell crash in the summer of 1947, but also such secretive alleged underground bases such as Dulce. Utah is also home to one of the strangest locations not only in the United States, but on the planet, Skinwalker Ranch. Now, an entire episode could be dedicated to Skinwalker Ranch, and many programs and documentaries have already been made, but needless to say, it is certainly a place where many bizarre events unfold. And then there is Colorado, where there are not only many UFO sightings, but a seemingly increased military presence, not least in the form of NORAD, as well as claims, as bizarre as they might sound, of underground extraterrestrial bases of some kind residing there, with some researchers claiming it to be a location better described as an alien stronghold. Although we should, of course, take such claims with caution. One last thing to mention in relation to the high strangeness of the Four Corners region is the Anasazi tribe, who called this region home for over 2,000 years, somewhere between 1500 BC and the early 13th century. Then, however, for reasons unknown, despite having constructed advanced settlements and cities, they simply vanished, with no record of where they went or why. Moreover, no evidence has ever been discovered of any kind of sudden mass migration. They did, for all intents and purposes, vanish into thin air. With all this in mind, it is interesting to note the discovery of spiral-like markings in the rock walls of these former settlements, spirals that to some people represent a portal of some kind, or even a round disc-shaped object such as a UFO. although many mainstream researchers suggest these spirals are simply depictions of the sun. Some researchers have suggested the tribe are victims of some kind of mass alien abduction, while others have put forward that some kind of event occurred, one that even resulted in the opening of a gateway into which the entire civilization ventured into either voluntarily or was swallowed up. These suggestions perhaps sound less bizarre when we consider that many of the legends of the Native American tribes today, some of whom state they are descendants of the Anasazi, state that their ancestors were merely going home. Make of that what you will. Now, while the Four Corners region as a whole is a strange part of the United States, without a doubt one of the most paranormally active regions in Colorado is the San Luis Valley. Now let's remind ourselves of Katie speaking about this.
And in the San Luis Valley, we have Mount Blanca, very similar. Way before Snippy was mutilated, people, the kings even, multiple people would see these balls of light or craft or however you want to label them flying in and out of the mouth of the mountain, Mount Blanca. There's actually a YouTube video on 6 mysterious mountains of Colorado. Mount Blanca was one of the first ones where this basically doorway opens up. These explorers go in, the door shuts on them. It's this cone of silence, very eerie, loss of time. Again, they're just very mysterious mountain, which makes me think too, is this like connected to Dulce, right? Are there tunnels underground because of the Husky? So last year at Contact in the Desert, I get an email from a woman whose father was high up in CIA. And they had property in the San Luis Valley. She said that area of the San Luis Valley is crawling with feds, CIA, FBI, Oppenheimer, and her family. They owned a lot of property out there at the Dulce base as well. So I'm interviewing her and her mother, and they're talking about a program her father was in, and they experimented with a drug that they called FM, which stands for freaking magic, which was a combination
I've
of
talked about that.
LSD and hallucinate. And I'm like, okay, that ties then directly into Rocky Mountain Ranch. So there's definitely that piece that's going on there. I have no doubt that they were doing something. But then there's the other piece of it that is unexplained, the paranormal side of things, the strength, like when I was filming with Beyond Skinwalker, I'm like, okay, what can they fake? When can they not fake? What's like, it's just blurs everything.
Now, the San Luis Valley is indeed one of the strangest locations on the planet, and moreover, it has a long history of strange goings-on. Around a dozen Native American tribes have called the region home over the centuries, with some researchers even suggesting that human beings have inhabited the region for around 7,000 years, with some of the tribes even referring to the San Luis Valley as the place of creation. Even more intriguing are the Native American legends of Blanca Massif, one of the most mysterious mountains of the San Luis Valley, and a place where the Navajo, for example, state that the Star People entered the world on flying seed pods, a description that is perhaps similar to disc-shaped craft, or for want of a better phrase, flying saucers. Furthermore, we might ask just how these mountains facilitate the entry into our world. Might there be, for example, the existence of portals or gateways in the region? Whatever the truth, there are plenty of strange accounts from the region on record, many of which involve UFOs, of which there are hundreds at least of reports on record. And one of the most intriguing of these occurred in the mid-1960s, when a local resident, Robert Whiting, was driving along the highway when he noticed a bizarrely shaped object suddenly appear beside his car. Now, even stranger, at the same time, he claimed to have received telepathic communication from the apparent occupants of the craft, or at least the intelligence behind it. And this told him that the body of a dead animal was lying in the road, and if he didn't slow down, it would cause him to crash. Now, he immediately slowed his speed, and several moments later, he could see the body of a dog in the middle of the road. Now, following this bizarre experience, the telepathic communication occurred again on several occasions. There have been many other UFO sightings and encounters in the San Luis Valley, with all manner of craft witnessed. In fact, as the 2000s unfolded, a UFO watchtower was constructed where many UFO researchers and enthusiasts venture to, and many of whom do indeed witness these strange objects. Now, there are also multiple Bigfoot sightings in the San Luis Valley region, with these sightings also stretching back decades. One of the most interesting run of encounters occurred over several weeks in late December 1993 into early January 1994, with all of the encounters taking place within the same 7 square mile radius. Now, one of these reports, which occurred on New Year's Eve 1993, resulted in several huge footprints being discovered. These tracks went on for several hundred yards, negotiating various different terrains as they did so. Another baffling encounter came from a mother and her son, who encountered a dark, hairy creature with large pointed ears and glowing red eyes as they made their way home following a day in the mountains. They claimed the creature stood upright like a person before it dropped down to all fours and ran away like a dog. It is also worth our time examining a report that unfolded in August 2000, when two all-terrain vehicle operators were on Blanca Peaks and they spotted what they thought was a man ahead of them. However, the closer they got, they could see that the man appeared to be wearing the same fur-like colour from head to toe. Then, without warning, the figure suddenly disappeared into the trees at the roadside. The two ATV operators left their vehicles and ventured into the woodland to search for the strange person. A few moments later, they came to a clearing. Now, they scanned their surroundings, and there, on the other side of the clearing, was a strange man. But they could now see that this man was more beast-like, and he was covered in brown, shaggy hair or fur. Moreover, this creature was at least 7 feet in height. Now, the next thing they realised, this creature took off at a remarkable speed and disappeared out of sight. Now, before we move on, one thing that came up during our conversation with Paige was the importance of learning and understanding history, including historic cases, and the potential new information that can come out of studying and re-examining such cases. Let's remind ourselves of Katie speaking about this.
So just ridiculous theories that, now all these years later. And to me, that my big message with this case is history is important. Yes. And it's never too late to go back and re-examine these historical cases because we're learning so much.
I totally agree.
We're talking to one another and we can connect more dots than we could even 10 years ago. Exactly. Like the boxes, like the smells, like the holes in the ground, on and on and on. Pop it into a smart computer and all of a sudden all these cases are starting to connect some dots that we have to take a second look at this stuff. And the really interesting piece, I think moving forward, it's kind of this messy world we're in right now with CGI and AI and just being inundated with information. So I think it's imperative that the younger generations coming up don't throw away history, don't throw away historical data. It's at their fingertips now if you know the right places to look. I think there's a lot of good people out there trying to, digitize a lot of this history. And so we're going to get to a point, and I think whoever is trying to control or steer the narrative knows that we're going to hit this critical point where there's going to be so much information being fed in these computers that they're not going to be able to shut this down forever. And so I just think that we got to keep fighting the good fight and communicating with one another and looking at the historical stuff, digitize old data so we don't have to go through this whole wall as old magazines and books, and it would take me a lifetime to just scratch the surface of this stuff. And we just got to keep sharing, talking about it, doing podcasts, communicating, doing shows, putting out Snippy Book, just getting the information out there so we can connect dots. And it's not too late, even 58 years later, to connect dots.
Yeah.
And I think that's my important message anyway. And to not be overwhelmed by everything. I guess we have to stay, we have to educate ourselves and try to weed out the...
Now, a great example of the importance to constantly reinvestigate and re-explore old cases and historic events is the work of the late Christopher O'Brien, who carried out extensive research and investigations into none other than the San Luis Valley. Now, thankfully for us, the findings and documentation of that research and those investigations can be found in multiple articles and several books. And as years go on and more enthusiasts, researchers and investigators enter the paranormal world, those findings can be re-explored and re-investigated in the hope that new information or perhaps even new perspectives come to light. Now, another location that is as intriguing as it is mysterious is Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England, right down to its origins and purpose, which, at least according to some, are far from settled. It is, though, also a place with multiple paranormal encounters and strange urban legends associated with it. Now, before we move on to explore some of these mysterious encounters, let's remind ourselves of Steve speaking about this.
It's about over 70% of them have been relocated to negative regions for some reason. I do not know reasons why that might be. It's very odd. But we have that in the UK as well. I mean, Stonehenge, I mean, I've seen many people visit Stonehenge and children playing on the stones many years ago when I went back. It's all fenced off now, but what they didn't realise is that the child sat on this stone. It's a sacrificial stone. It's, for blood worship. And that's what Stonehenge was. And it's in a negative region where military facilities are close by, weapon manufacturers are close by, chemical military facility as well. And, it's just coincidental you start to see little patterns, and I don't quite understand the reasoning behind that. But I think that we can't kind of get away from the areas, the locations, because there always tends to be, I don't know, rock around. If it's not a mountain, there's some type of mesa, or there's something around geologically that seemingly fit the bill with other locations.
Now, one of the most intriguing of these Stonehenge encounters has to be taken with a considerable helping of salt, and is one that is most likely more urban legend than historical encounter. Even so, it is worth exploring briefly here. Now, according to most versions of the account, on the evening of August 18th, 1971, a group of 5 American students visiting England ventured to Stonehenge to camp among the stones. That night, however, a short time after midnight, a powerful storm swept through, unleashing wind, rain and lightning down on Salisbury Plain and the campers at Stonehenge. Then one of the lightning bolts hit one of the stones of the ancient monument. Now, according to the account, as this storm was unfolding, a patrolling policeman was driving close to Stonehenge, while a nearby farmer also had the monument in sight. They both witnessed a brilliant blue glow suddenly flare up from the site, while at the same time they could hear sounds of terrified screams. Both men instinctively headed towards the site, suspecting that one or more of the campers had been hit by lightning. However, upon arrival, instead of discovering injured campers, all that remained was the smouldering remains of several tent pegs. Now, while there might be considerable doubt about that account, as interesting as it might be, there are many other strange incidents at Stonehenge, some of which have been documented through Freedom of Information Acts. Now, researcher and author Nick Redfern reveals some of these strange incidents in his book, The Pyramids and the Pentagon. One such incident occurred in the 1950s and featured a military training exercise within the immediate vicinity of the site. Now, at some stage during these exercises, several strange balls of light appeared overhead, and it soon became apparent to the unit that their superiors had some kind of prior knowledge to these bizarre balls of light, giving the unit strict orders to pursue them. Now, they did so and eventually followed them to Stonehenge. Then, once they were directly over the stones, the orbs shot upwards and disappeared from view. Before they disappeared, though, several of the soldiers directly below the orbs reported what can only be described as plasma-like phenomena. These orbs morphed into a variety of different entities. One soldier, for example, reported the orb morphing into a dragon. Another said they saw an angelic entity, while yet another claimed to have seen a creature that appeared like an octopus. Now, whether this strange event was part of some kind of military experiment or not remains open to debate. However, as Redfern notes, several years later, a local woman was walking near the site when she noticed several strange orbs close to the monument. Intrigued, she walked towards the orbs, and when she was almost directly below them, one of them suddenly dropped to the ground and morphed into a large worm-like creature with bulging eyes that looked directly at her. Not waiting to see any more, the woman turned and ran. Now, we might imagine, though, that her encounters shared the same mechanics and interaction as the experiments by the military unit several years previously. Of course, just what these orbs might be is another matter, and remains at least for now unanswered. Could these events be a result of ley lines that run through the site? Ley lines, incidentally, that also run through ancient sites around the world. And if this is the case, is this proof that those in antiquity not only knew of the apparent power of the earth, but knew how to harness it, for reasons we can only guess at? Could this combination of ley lines, natural energy, and stone and rock contribute to creating some kind of gateway or portal? And could these conditions reside in such regions as the Four Corners or the San Luis Valley? Now, several years ago, I visited Stonehenge with my wife, and we experienced several strange events during that visit. And in truth, those strange events started the night before. Despite the fact we were staying in the middle of nowhere, there was this distinct buzz that can only be described as magic in the air, some kind of charge to the atmosphere. Now, when we did get to the Stonehenge complex, it was a bright sunny day, very warm, perfect conditions to check out this ancient monument. Now, to get to the site itself, you can either walk, but you usually drive around 3 or 4 minutes up a small private road. Now, by the time we had done that and stepped out into the path directly outside Stonehenge, within the outer perimeter, the heavens simply opened, and I mean it was pouring down, and it did so with no let-up for 5, maybe 10 minutes. And then, just like that, it stopped, as if the rain had come from a tap that had been turned off. Now, anyway, we went about our visit and walked among the stones, and it's a truly captivating experience. And while we were doing so, I noticed an American couple who was standing near a particular stone, and I could hear this young lady say to who I presume was her boyfriend or husband that she could feel the stones pulling on her hands, and she had her hands like this against the stones where she was standing. Now, I stayed close by, and after a minute or so, as amused as they were, they moved on. Now, I immediately went to stand in the same spot as this young lady, and after letting my hand fall by my side, directly adjacent to the stone's surface, I could indeed feel a slight pull. Now, this wasn't like a strong pull of a magnet to metal, something I couldn't resist. If anything, you almost had to relax and then give in to this soft pulling sensation. And for a moment, it felt like my hand was propelled almost magnetically between the pull of the rock and the gravity wanted to pull it back to my side. What's more, my wife tried this a few moments later, and not only did she feel the same sensation, but when she stepped away from those stones, although not as dramatically, she had to push her dress down as it had flared out like the famous shot of Marilyn Monroe. Now, that is strange stuff indeed. As a further point of interest to all of this, as we wandered around the stones for a couple of hours, we noticed a pair of hairs suddenly scamper out from behind one of them and off into the distance. Now, it is perhaps interesting to note that some legends speak of witches, and for want of a better word, being able to transform themselves into hares in order to move about undetected. And while in this case such legends are based on nothing more than suspicious superstitions designed to arrest and condemn people accused of witchcraft, it is intriguing that legends of shapeshifters throughout Europe, including England, they are rife and often speak of such entities transforming themselves into animals to escape detection. Okay, before we get too carried away, let's wrap this up and tell you to leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to our channel, and follow us on social media. And check out the Anomaly Project podcast.com for further articles, news, and updates. Until next time, goodbye and take care.